At the end of the Mexican War in 1848, Americans became increasingly divided between North and South on the issue of whether or not to extend slavery into these new territories that had been acquired from Mexico. Now, these heated debates that occurred over the extension of slavery, what they did was they reflected the fact that in the North and the South, two very different economic and social systems had developed. So by the mid-19th century, the North and the South, the free states and the slave states, were two very different societies, and each thought that their system was superior to the economic system of the other. Now, this division of the United States between North and South, it resulted from the fact that the market revolution had transformed the entire nation, had transformed the society of the United States and the economy, and this market revolution was sweeping across Europe and the United States in the 18th and the 19th century. Now, this market revolution that changed both the North and the South, it was a result of the tremendous growth of a global market economy. And this tremendous growth had resulted from the fact that there had been dramatic population increases in Europe and America, and as well as tremendous advances in technology and science in this period. So what we're going to be doing is look at the situation, how these two different societies developed. We're going to be looking at, first of all, westward expansion and population growth in America. Second of all, we're going to look at how advances in technology and industry and transportation, how this stimulated the market economy in both the North and the South. And finally, we're also going to look about how this market revolution resulted in large-scale immigration to the United States and the rapid growth of cities in the United States. This is the process of urbanization. We're going to keep in mind when we look at these developments that this market revolution transformed the North and the South in very, very different ways. So we're going to begin to look at westward expansion. Now, in the 18th and 19th centuries around the world, especially in the United States and Europe, you had this tremendous expansion in population. There are a number of reasons for this. One reason was that beginning in the 18th century, the world entered a warming trend. Climate change has always been with us, and in the 18th century, the world's climate was getting warmer. Now, this actually had the benefit for Europeans and Americans of allowing for greater harvests. Warmer temperatures meant longer growing seasons and more harvests, and so you had more and more food to support a growing population. Another factor for this tremendous population growth was the introduction of new nutritious crops to the entire world. Potatoes and maize, or Indian corn, were indigenous to the New World, but their use was spread to the whole rest of the world. And both of these crops are very nutritious, and they provided a stable source of food. Now, with people around the world in Europe and America eating better, that meant that they had more resistance to epidemic diseases. So epidemic diseases declined dramatically, and that also served to boost population growth. Now, another factor in the growth of agriculture and food production were new innovations. And we can't go over all of them, but just give you one example. By 1841, an American inventor by the name of Cyrus McCormick, he invented the mechanical reaper. Now, this mechanical reaper could do the work of 12 men, what it took 12 men to do with the traditional way of harvesting crops. So what this did was it made it a lot easier and more efficient to harvest crops. That's just one example, but there are a host of new innovations in agriculture that serve to boost agricultural production, create more food, and therefore support a larger population. Now, as the population grew, what happened is that a lot of immigrants from Europe began to pour into this country, and Americans, as the population grew, Americans wanted to move out west. They wanted to settle the more sparsely inhabited territories out in the frontier. And so over the course of the 19th century, all these new settlers, what they did was effectively transform wilderness and prairies into productive farmland. And this only served to further increase the food supply and allow for even greater population growth. Now, just to give you the idea of how fast this westward expansion was taking place, during most of the first half of the 19th century, our federal government actually ran on surpluses. We always hear about the deficit today, but in the 19th century, the federal government was actually taking in more than it was spending. And a lot of the money that was flowing into the federal government came from the sale of federal land, because people were just moving out west and buying up this land. And it was the policy of the federal government to sell this land as fast as Americans could buy them. In fact, so many Americans were moving out west that a lot of Americans didn't even bother to purchase the land. They would just go out there and just settle down. But the United States government took the position that it was important that these people be recognized, that they have the opportunity to buy title to the land. So beginning in 1831, Congress began to pass what were called preemption acts, which these preemption acts allowed squatters, people who just settled on land without buying it, it gave them the opportunity to actually purchase the land and gain title to the land. By the mid-19th century, you could buy up to 160 acres of land for $1.25 an acre. So basically, the United States government was doing everything in its power to encourage people to move out west. That was part of Jefferson's dream of an empire of liberty. Now, by the middle of the 19th century, Americans had moved out west, so that basically the area from the Atlantic to the Mississippi Valley had all that area had been incorporated into new states in the federal union. Now, the economic development of these western lands was very different in the Midwest. Places like Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Illinois, Iowa. This was very different than the economic system that developed, let's say, in the Deep South. Places like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and East Texas. In the Midwest, what we see happening is that the settlement patterns were very similar to what they had been in the colonial period in the middle colonies and in New England. For example, what we see happening is that most of the people who moved into the Midwest built small family-operated farms. Usually these farms were on average between 65 and 160 acres in size. So you don't have big estates worked by tenant farmers or by farm hands. You had basically the work that was done on these small farms was done by the family, the husband, wife, and the kids and relatives. And this area was all free states, because remember back in 1787, the Northwest Ordinance had prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory. Now, in the Midwest, people practiced subsistence agriculture. Farmers raised livestock, cattle, they raised wheat, and they raised corn. And for the most part, farmers lived off what they grew, but whatever they didn't grow, they sold on the market. The market for farmers in the Midwest were the rising cities that were growing, especially the cities up in the Northeast, like New York and Philadelphia and Boston. Now, in the Midwest, the economy was all based around agriculture, and the cities that developed in the Midwest were all based on industries related to agriculture. Like St. Louis was famous for its distilleries, where you take wheat and make it into liquor, and its breweries. Chicago was well known for its cattle markets. That's where you went to market your cattle. Milwaukee was well known for its breweries and its meatpacking plants. And Cleveland was known as Flour City because of all the flour mills that were in that city. A lot of times these origins of these cities are reflected in their sports team, the Chicago Bulls, the Milwaukee Brewers, so forth. Now, when we look at other parts of the country, one area that looked a lot like the Midwest was the parts of the Upper South. Places like Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky. in a lot of these areas, you had areas like in East Tennessee where the soil was too rocky, as they say in the Rocky Top song. You couldn't have plantations and in parts of East Tennessee and parts of Kentucky. And these areas, what we see is that you see family farms just like you do in the Midwest. In fact, there was a lot of connection between the Midwest and Tennessee and Kentucky, because a lot of times settlers from these areas moved into the Midwest. In fact, remember the most famous example being Abraham Lincoln. Remember, Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky, and as a boy he moved from Kentucky to Illinois. So there was a lot of connections between the Midwest and parts of the Upper South. So that was the case in that particular part of the country. Now, in the Deep South, a very different story. In the Deep South and in the Upper South, where you had soil that was suitable, in these areas the climate and the soil was perfect for the cultivation of what we call cash crops. Crops like cotton being number one, but also tobacco, and in Louisiana and East Texas you had sugar cane. But primarily cotton was one of the main crops produced in the Deep South especially. Now, in most of the Deep South and in these areas, you still had family-operated farms. You know, most people still had farms ranging between 65 and 160 acres. So for most of the people in the Midwest and for the Deep South, they had a very similar economic situation. One thing that was different about the Deep South was the existence of these large plantations employing slave labor. And these large plantations making money off of slave labor, and they were especially profitable because of cotton production. You see, there was a tremendous demand for cotton worldwide. Cotton produced in the South was sent up north to cotton mills up in the Northeast, but primarily a good deal of America's cotton was exported overseas to places like Great Britain and France and Germany and the Netherlands. Cotton was America's #1 export. In fact, by the mid-19th century, about 50% of all of America's exports, about 50% of them was cotton. Great Britain was one of America's biggest customers for their cotton. And the United States was kind of like the Saudi Arabia of cotton. By the mid-19th century, the United States cotton growers were producing about 60% of the world's entire supply of cotton. Now, what made cotton production so profitable was slavery. Slave owners were some of the wealthiest people in America. 2/3 of the wealthiest families living in the United States before the Civil War made their money from cotton production and slavery. One reason why it was so productive to be and so profitable to be in cotton production was because of slavery. You see, cotton is what we call labor-intensive product. It takes a lot of work to grow cotton. Now, if cotton growers had to pay people to work in their cotton fields, everything would have been sunk into their labor costs. They would have been too expensive. But slave labor, you see, made cotton growing very profitable because you didn't have to pay slaves anything. Basically, you could, they couldn't count on the free white population to provide labor, so they could rely on these slaves and basically just provide them a very minimal amount of food and housing, and it was very low cost for them. So their labor costs were low, and that allowed planters to be very wealthy, some of the richest people in America. Now, it's important to remember that the planters within the South remained a very tiny elite within the South. One of the reasons was that slaves were very expensive. Remember, the slave trade had been banished by the Constitution, and the slave trade was illegal after 1808. So slaves were very expensive. Today, just to give you an idea of how expensive a slave would be, a slave in today's money would be about the cost of buying a Mercedes-Benz or a, a luxury car. I mean, they were very, very expensive. So the number of people who owned large number of slaves were quite small. Like, just to give you an example, the South before the Civil War, just before the Civil War, the South had a population of about 8 million people. And only 10,000 families in the South owned more than a dozen slaves. And of those 10,000, only 3,000 owned more than 100 slaves. Now, in the Deep South, the majority of African American slaves, they lived on these large, giant plantations. So most African Americans lived in segregated communities on these large plantations that were owned by only a very small elite of the entire Southern population. Now, you'd think that since the planters made up such a small percentage that they wouldn't have a lot of political support, but that was not the case. In general, the white population in the South had a lot of respect and admiration for the planter class, primarily because they wanted to join their ranks. You got to remember that about 25% of the free white population owned slaves. So about 1 out of every 4 Southern families owned slaves. Now, for most of these slave owners, they only owned maybe 1 or 2, or 3 or 4. I mean, they owned less than 10. But for these slave owners who had sizable amounts of land and maybe had a couple of slaves, their goal was to make enough money so that they could enter the ranks of the wealthy plantation owners. So for the most part, these people provided the political support for the elite planters. And that's why the elite planters, even though they made up a very small percentage of the population, they pretty much monopolized the federal and the state offices across the South. So they were the dominant political power. So we can see that in the North and the South, when it came to the settlement of the West, 2 very different systems developed in the Midwest and in the Deep South. Now, another thing we see happening at this time was that tremendous advances were made in transportation. You got to remember that in a market economy, it's important to get your goods to market. And farmers, for example, had to get their crops, and cotton growers had to get their cotton to markets up in the north and overseas. And so what happened was that in the 19th century, there were tremendous innovations in transportation that allowed producers of goods to get their goods to markets faster than ever before in human history. One important development was the steamboat. The first steamboat used a steam engine, and the first steamboats were plying the Hudson River as early as 1809. And these steamboats, you didn't have to depend upon the river flow of the river. You could just get on the steamboat. It had its own engine. You could sail up and down rivers that way. And now what we see is that pretty soon, by the mid-19th century, steamboats were operating all along the major natural waterways of the United States: Mississippi River, the Ohio River, the Tennessee River, the Great Lakes. Steamboats connected America through these natural waterways. And what we see in the South was that major southern ports like New Orleans and Mobile and Savannah and Charleston and Baltimore, this is where the steamboats brought their goods, and then from these ports they could export their goods overseas to Great Britain and to other European nations. Now, in the Northeast and in the Midwest, you have a situation where you don't have as good of rivers as you do down south. The rivers up north aren't nearly as smooth flowing and as navigable as the rivers down south. So in the 1820s and the 1830s, up north in places like New York and Ohio and Pennsylvania, they constructed canals. The purpose of the canal was to connect natural waterways to make it easier for the flow of traffic to take place. Now, the innovator in building canals was the state of New York. And the first real successful canal was the Erie Canal. It was completed in 1825. Now, the governor of DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York, got a lot of heat. It was called the Great Ditch. But when it was completed, the Erie Canal was one of the great success stories. What it did is it connected the Great Lakes with Lake Erie, where Buffalo, New York is. It connected it with Albany, New York, along the Hudson River. So because of the Erie Canal, what you could do is you could transport goods from the Great Lakes to the Hudson River and then down to the great port of New York City along the Hudson River. So as a result of the Erie Canal, what you had was a connection between goods being produced, agricultural goods being produced in the Midwest, and the great port of New York City. In fact, people have said that the Erie Canal made the port of New York City into the great port that it would become. Now, the great success of the Erie Canal got everybody all excited. And so in the 1830s, you actually had, it was called Canal Mania. States across the North were building canals everywhere. And primarily what these canals did was to connect Midwestern farmers growing agricultural goods with the growing cities that were emerging in the Northeast, cities like Boston and Philadelphia and New York City. So the canal system linked the Midwest to the Northeast. Meanwhile, the South was kind of on its own because its ports were sending goods directly to Europe. So you had a lot of east-west traffic going up north, but not a lot of traffic going north-south. The canals weren't built north-south. They're all built east-west. Now, the canals were replaced in the 1840s by a new technological marvel, the railroad. Now, the railroads were invented in England, and by the 1820s, the railroad was introduced to the United States. The first railroad line was finished in 1828, and it connected the port of Baltimore with Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was the beginning of the Great Ohio River Valley, and so it connected a port with a major river system, and that was the first great railroad line. Now, railroad construction really picked up in the 1830s, and by the 1840s, about 10,000 miles of track were laid across the United States. Now, what happened is that railroad tracks followed the routes of the old canals. A lot of times, canals went out of use when they were replaced by new railroad lines. So the railroads tended to connect the Midwest to the Northeast. Now, in the South, you had a different situation. In the South, they chose not to build railroads in the South, primarily because they felt that the steamboats were all they needed to have. The steamboats were effective, and so they never really got into building railroads. Why spend a lot of money and invest to build railroads when you have perfectly good river systems and steamboats to carry your cotton? So the North and the South, in terms of transportation systems, were quite different. Now, another thing the South did not invest in is they did not invest in new industries and new factories, a very different situation than the North. So let's talk about innovations in manufacturing. You see, as the population grew around in Europe and America, with population growth, you had a demand for goods because people need goods, especially cloth. And you steel for tools and weapons, cloth for clothes. With a growing population, these goods were in great demand. So some of the first innovations in industry were in the fields of steel production and cotton or cloth production. Now, there was a whole new system of manufacturing. It's called the factory system. And this system first arose in England in the second half of the 18th century, and from there it spread to the United States. What was key to the development of the factory system was the invention of the steam engine. James Watt, an Englishman, in 1765 invented one of the first really efficient steam engines. And what a steam engine does is it burns a fossil fuel, coal, and turns coal into energy. So it used coal to produce energy. And after 1765, with the steam engine, you could use a steam engine to run labor-saving devices. So by the 18th century, inventors were creating new devices to be able to mass-produce cloth. So by the late 18th century, you had a situation where you could use steam engines to operate these new devices. Now, it made sense to locate all of these new machines, the steam engines and the labor-saving devices, in a central location, and therefore bring the workers to work on the machines. And this central location became known as the factory. So investors began to invest in machines and build factories, and then workers would come and work in these factories. And the first factories were devoted to cloth mills, cloth production and steel production. Now what we see happening is that factories came to replace the earlier system of manufacturing, which is known as cottage industry. It used to be, before factories came along, that workmen and craftsmen worked out of their homes, their cottages. They worked in their workshops were located right next to their house or in their house. But now, because of the factory system, you had a situation where factories were centrally located, and the workers would leave their homes to come and work in the factory. Now, factories were started in England, but they were introduced in larger and larger numbers to the United States by the early 19th century. Remember the Embargo Act? The Embargo Act and the War of 1812 really boosted factories and manufacturing here in the United States, because during that time Americans were denied manufactured goods produced in Great Britain. So America began to mass produce its own cloth and its own steel right here in the United States. Now, the first factories to be built were primarily in New England and in the Northeast. And it made sense that they were built there. Remember, the New England never really was a great agricultural region, so it made sense to put your investments in something other than agriculture. And another thing about the North and New England was that this area had always been into commerce and trade, and so you had money there. You had investors up in the North who had the financial resources, the capital, to invest in building these new factories. And factories were very expensive. They required a large amount of money up front to really get them going. You had to buy the steam engines and all the machines and the building, and had to bring the workers there and pay them. So the first factories tended to be built in places like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and New York. Now, in the South, there really wasn't any reason to build factories, because there was so much money to be made in cotton production. So if you had money in the South, you weren't going to invest it in a factory. You were going to invest it in slaves and in land, because cotton production was the way to go. So in the South, you didn't have any real incentive to build factories, so factories just weren't built there. So you had a very, very different situation. Now, with the advent of the railroad, you see, railroads boosted manufacturing, because railroads need steel, they need parts, and so when railroads were being built up north, this really got the steel industry and manufacturing really moving and stimulated up north. But remember, the South did not invest in railroads. So the result, railroad construction and railroads really boosted industry up north, while the South remained very rural and very much tied to its plantation economy. Now, these economic developments in the North and South resulted in very different immigration patterns. You see, with the growth of factories in the Northeast, this resulted in the growth of cities. That's what we call urbanization. You see, factories are in a central location, so it made sense for workers to be in a town near the factory. So whenever factories were built, towns grew up around the factory. So people were moving in large numbers, especially in New England and up north in the Northeast. People were moving from the rural areas, from their farms, and getting jobs in these new factories. Or with the development of the steam engine, and there was a demand for coal, so coal created a lot of new jobs. You know, in western Pennsylvania, where you had a lot of coal, coal mining became a major industry. So now, the growth of American factories and American mines, coal mines, it brought people from the countryside into the cities, into the towns, but it also attracted large numbers of immigrants over from Europe. In England and Scotland and Ireland and Germany and the Netherlands, population growth was, job growth was not matching population growth. So there are a lot of people moving to America. Now a lot of these Americans, these people who were coming to America from Europe, a lot of them were moving out west. Just to give you an example, in a lot of Scandinavians, for example, settled in Wisconsin, in later Minnesota. A lot of Dutch settled in Michigan. For example, I have relatives in Michigan, and I was told there's a saying, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much, because of all the Dutch immigrants who settled in Michigan. So you had a lot of immigrants who were coming and settling out west, but a lot of immigrants were settling in towns and cities and working in the factories. One of the biggest onslaughts of immigration occurred in the 1840s from all these Irish that came over. In the mid-1840s, Ireland suffered from the potato famine. There was a blight on potatoes, and potatoes had become such a part of the diet in Ireland that when the potatoes were dying because of this blight, there was widespread hunger and starvation. So some 2 million Irishmen fleeing the potato famine came and settled in America in the mid-1840s. So huge amounts of Irishmen. Now, most of these immigrants who came decided to settle up north. They worked in factories, they worked in mines, or they settled out west in the Midwest, because there they could find land and they could find labor. They could find jobs working in the factories. There wasn't that much of an immigration to the South, primarily because of the slave population. Because of the numbers of slaves in the South, immigrants didn't want to move there because they didn't want to compete with slave labor. So as a result is that the North and the South became very different in terms of their demographics. The North became very, very diverse, very more cosmopolitan. You had Roman Catholic Irishmen and Germans and Dutch and people from different parts of Northern Europe coming in large numbers and settling in the North. And you also had the growth of cities. But the South, contrary to that, the South remained very rural, not a lot of big cities, and the population remained fairly static. Most of the people were Protestant. Most of them were English or of Scotch-Irish ancestry or Scottish ancestry. So what we see in the South, because it was so more rural and life there was a lot more slow, is that in the South the social conditions remain very, very, very conservative. So Southerners continued to show a lot of deference and respect to their betters. So we see in the South a lot of respect for a planter, the Southern gentleman, the planter class. And the planters kind of, since they lived in a more conservative society, they kind of assumed much of the lifestyle and the attitudes of European aristocrats. Whereas the North was much more diverse and much more egalitarian because of all these different people who were settling there. And in the North, more and more people in the North came to resent the fact that so many of these Southern planters dominated politics and controlled Congress. And in the North, they began to refer to these Southern planters as Slavocrats. You know, instead of aristocrats, they were Slavocrats. And meanwhile, the planters and the people in the South became increasingly defensive over the institution of slavery because they didn't like the fact that their institution and their lifestyle was being criticized and attacked by people up north. And it was this set of conditions that would create increasing rivalry between the North and the South by the mid-19th century. In the mid-19th century, another development we see happening that fueled sectional differences was that you had this age of reform and this Second Great Awakening that was stretching across the country. And that will be what we'll be examining in our next lesson.